Let's go ahead and get started. Nice to see everyone today virtually. My name is Rachel Ryan. I am a coach in the CDO. I've been here about 5 years. Some of you I may have worked with before. While here, I have done some of the alumni coaching. Additionally, just because I will pull from my background a little bit as we talk this through. But my background is in executive recruiting and also as an HR business partner at a consumer products company. And I also went to business school as well. So was once in those shoes and can relate to the process. But we will go ahead and jump right into our topic today, which is overcoming employment gaps. And that could look like a lot of different things for everybody. So of course, there's a personalized approach to this depending on your situation, the type of gap that you're trying to overcome as it relates to your background and where you're trying to go. And so just know that we can talk at the end about personalized follow-up, scheduling coaching appointments, and taking an individualized approach where it makes sense. But this should hopefully provide some foundational knowledge to help you think through how to approach tackling your employment gap as it relates to your full-time search. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so again, just an agenda here. We're going to talk about how to identify your gap, how to tell your story and kind of explain your gap, your delivery, and then we'll definitely have time for Q&A. At the end, I would say is probably the easiest time, and we'll have dedicated time where you can enter any questions in through the Q&A feature on your computer. So again, this is really going to help give you a bit of a framework to think through how to talk about any gap that you're experiencing in your career, how to address it on your resume, how to address it in conversation with people, and how to really give the gap some thought to make sure that you're explaining it in the appropriate way and getting ahead of any issues that it may present. Okay, so let's dig into your gap and what we even mean by gap. So in the context of this conversation, and we'll dig into this a little bit more as we go along, but a gap can mean a whole host of different things. And actually, it's something that I think, if anything, we've all experienced in some way, especially the last few years between COVID and different changes in the market. I think if we ourselves haven't experienced some sort of gap or change in terms of how our career has kind of worked, we certainly know someone either in our family or friend group. So I think this is something that's become just so much more common, which will actually, I think, make this a lot more approachable in general. But it could be a break from formal employment. It could be missing a criteria as you think about a job. So filling what feels like a gap in terms of key skills that maybe an employer is looking for, a perceived lack of expertise, missing or underdeveloped skills. Maybe you're trying to make some sort of pivot. So we think of gaps in a lot of different ways. And actually, we know that whether we've hired people before or made switches in our career, it's rare to ever hire someone into a job who's done that exact job before. I mean, almost never. That's how career development works, is as you're pivoting, as you're moving to your next role, you're always doing something new, and there's always some way that you're developing a new skill, stretching yourself, trying something new. So gaps are overcome all the time in some way. What we're going to talk about is maybe how to tackle a gap that's a little bit more specific in terms of time away from work for a variety of reasons and that kind of thing. But I guess it just kind of helps to frame the whole conversation around gaps as there's always a gap. This is just one kind of gap. So I think it's helpful to think about a gap in your career and really owning it. So identifying a gap from an employer's perspective. So let's play this out a little bit. So identify the gap. So for you, let's say that you were laid off, unfortunately, and you're taking some time to figure out what the right next step is. or maybe you're on an extended parental leave and decide to take some time away from the workforce after that to take care of your family, or a sick family member, or took some time off for an adventure and travel, whatever it may be. Think about that gap from the perspective of the employer. And what do I mean by that? Well, employers are always thinking about, and specifically recruiters and hiring managers are always thinking about, how do we bring someone in who's really going to be a low risk hire. Many times when they're openings, they need someone to start yesterday, and there isn't usually a ton of training and formal onboarding to really help someone hit the ground running. It's not like right after business school when you join some big rotational program or a big class of post-MBA hires. As we know, in the workforce, you're really expected to come in and bring your experience and be effective from day one in some way. So when an employer sees a gap, it's really about minimizing the risk that that gap presents and making the hiring manager feel really comfortable. So for it to seem like a low risk situation and a gap that's not going to get in the way of you being effective in whatever that role may be. So you want to have stories ready to go, showing that the relevant experience you bring, the transferable experience you bring, and speak about it with confidence. You want to have a resume with bullets set up that already kind of show how your experience is relevant to the role, and have practice telling the stories conversationally. I think the title of this slide, Owning the Gap, is probably the most important point from my perspective. I can just say, and we'll dig into this more as we go, but having hired people before many times with gaps, the first step in terms of bringing that person along was always the decision of, okay, I think this candidate's really great. I think they're going to do a good job. And I feel really confident having the business leader I work with take time from their busy schedule to meet with this person. As an HR business partner, for example, or in recruiting, it was really important to me, and this is true across the board, to have trusting relationships with the business leaders I worked with who knew that I had sound judgment and they could trust me to bring in great talent. And if I felt like someone was coming in and really explaining their story and why they took time out of the workforce effectively, then I felt really great about bringing them forward. But if it only raised questions, then, I might not want to do that. It would feel like a risky move and I'd go with another candidate. So own that gap and speak about it with confidence, and think about how to address it in a way that's honest, direct, simple to understand, and in the context of your story, be able to explain how you bring transferable skills and how you would be a great candidate for that position. One thing that we always hear is candidates saying, I feel really good about my resume, it looks great, but there's often a disconnect because they're not really getting any bites, because they're not really always thinking about, again, the view from the other side and the employer side. Is there a risk there that you're not addressing? So from a resume perspective, I can just kind of say, typically, if I would get a resume, I would, and I think a lot of people do this, you probably do this as well, I'd, scan it over, I'd go right to the bottom, go in chronological order up and scan to get a sense of someone's career progression. Just to kind of get the notes in terms of, okay, this is how this person's career has taken twists, turns, and this is the path. I think it's important that your resume be presented in a way that's clear, and gaps happen all the time. I just think there might be times where addressing that on the resume or in some kind of way, or making sure that there's not just some huge question that a reader would have reading your resume is important. So what are some reasons for an employment gap? And it could truly be anything, but common reasons for gaps would be, as I mentioned before, caring for a family member, maybe experiencing a health issue, relocating and finding a job in a new state or city. Sometimes people, as you know, might move, maybe for a variety of reasons, and they move before they get the job. Sometimes it's an easier way to do it. Maybe it's pursuing further education, taking time off to travel, loss of employment, spending some time freelancing, and maybe you've been searching for a while and have just had trouble finding a job. This conversation today really applies to any reason that you have for your gap. Maybe it's a gap that was by choice and maybe not, but there's always a way to articulate the gap in a way that can make the hiring manager feel comfortable, in a way that's honest, and in a way that still is presenting your candidacy in the best possible light. So you just want to avoid common mistakes, hiding behind an older functional resume that doesn't kind of take into account the skills that are most relevant for the role. I think expecting an employer to kind of figure out your path if it's not presented as clearly. Sometimes I've seen candidates almost try and hide a gap, but it only raises more questions. So being clear and making it as easy as possible on the hiring manager to just understand your career path. Definitely don't panic, because we all probably experience a gap at some point. So have hiring managers probably, and recruiters and the other side. That's life. We're all human, and there's so many different reasons for potentially having an employment gap. So there's nothing to hide at all. Some things to do: create context in terms of the skills that you bring, translate prior experience into their corporate language, know your worth, confidence, and a good attitude. It really matters. And we'll talk about the delivery and all of that, but confidence and positivity makes such a difference in terms of how you explain the reason for your employment gap and why you might be out of the workforce, why you might be out of a job. Again, if it's not by choice, there's a way to do that. So really, really important. Let's talk about your story. So again, you're not the only one at all who has some sort of a gap. And I alluded to this earlier, but I would say 10, 15 years ago, when I saw that someone maybe was out of work, maybe they experienced a layoff, or they were freelancing for a long time, I'd really feel a need to dig into it and have a lot of questions around why that was, because it was less common. And now I think since 2020, I think it's extremely common, whether it had to do with an organizational change, layoffs, so many people having to deal with health issues, others with health issues. I think a lot of people wanted to make a life change after experiencing COVID. We've seen that a lot in terms of just priority shifts, obviously huge childcare issues. So I just think that there's so many candidates out there with recent gaps. It really raises so few questions relative to 10, 15 years ago. Like I mentioned, if I were to see someone with an employment gap now, I would just want to understand the story behind it and how that's influencing their decision-making going forward. I would not have nearly as many questions or concerns about it. So I think it's important to keep in mind the context of where we are today in 2023, and that lean into it to know that so many other candidates out there are in the same boat for a lot of different reasons. Recruiters understand, so absolutely don't overthink it. Just anticipate the questions, prepare responses. I wouldn't overshare either. Sometimes there can be this balance in terms of, let's say that you were that your employment was terminated. Let's say it wasn't a good fit, candidly, in a really toxic situation. You've had great professional experiences before, but this, the manager that you just had was a horrible manager and it was just a terrible fit. There's only so much that you want to share. You want to keep it positive, keep it factual, and don't fill the silences. Less is more. Share what you did during your gap, during your break. I think there's a way to explain your time off in a way that can be really compelling. And I just think that if you're thinking ahead and anticipating the questions and preparing responses, by addressing it directly and thinking, if I were hiring this person, what would be the risk? What would be the concern that comes along with this gap? So let's say it's someone who, let's say that, like the example before, that you had to change roles because, or your role was eliminated, let's say. So what's the concern with that from a hiring manager perspective? It's, well, was it performance related? And if it was performance related, is that a repeat of, is that an issue time and time again? So how do you get ahead of that? So I've had candidates say to me, it just really wasn't the right fit in my last role. I think I'm really kind of leaning into this position I'm in terms of thinking about what the right next step is for me that really leverages my strengths, my experiences. I have some really great, I was at least fortunate enough to develop some fantastic relationships. I have fantastic references, leaders I've worked with both in my previous roles and more recently, who would be happy to share more insight into my contributions and my strengths. So whenever I hear that someone has proactive references in that situation, I think it's really helpful. Let's say you're someone who took time off for other reasons. What's my biggest concern? Probably that they've stayed up to date with their skills and have kept their skills sharp. And how do you address that? I've done a little bit of freelance work, or I've taken some classes, or I've read up on the industry, stayed current, had some time to reflect, and I'm really excited about going in this direction. Sometimes, we all know that when someone has space from things, they can even think more clearly going forward. So just being proactive and addressing that gap up front. And I think a good example is always sharing that you have strong references, always gets ahead of any of that concern. So I mentioned this earlier, but leaning into the gap, how did you grow from the gap? How can your gap time, your time off, actually be leveraged to be a strength? Part of interviewing and networking and building relationships with employers is about relating to them and just building that relationship. I know for me, having hired people before, maybe you can relate to this as well. I really love to understand the whole person. I find it really, really interesting to know, what does this person like to do for fun? Like, what are their hobbies? What's important to them? And so if your time off, for example, allowed you to do things that you haven't done before, maybe spend more time learning, developing a new skill, or just spending time with your family that's really important to you, or coaching a team, or whatever it may be, that's a great thing to share with an employer. Again, framing it positively. And I think, could be a great example of how you might be a strong cultural fit potentially in that organization. If it has to do with a medical issue or caring for someone, I think, it shows your strong values in terms of taking your time to really care for the people in your life. And so, of course, only share what you feel comfortable with, but everyone is human, as I mentioned earlier, and showing how you used your time to grow in some way, or how it reflects the person you are, can actually make you an even stronger candidate. Truthfully, I think that if there are cases where there's an employer who's really going to have an issue with the fact that maybe you had to do something on a personal level, maybe that's a good moment to stop and pause and think, is this the right fit for me? Because these things really come up, especially over the last few years. And you want to be with an employer that understands that. So closing that gap, again, thinking about ways that you can kind of address the gap, but also show that it was valuable. Maybe there's some part-time work that you were involved in or freelance work. Show that, put that down. I think that that actually, in many ways, closes the gap. Even if it wasn't full-time, not even close to full-time, just a couple freelance projects, I actually think that that's super, super helpful to put on the resume and speak to. Similarly, volunteer work. If there's something you got really involved in that shows your leadership skills or your involvement in the community, absolutely worth talking about. Any coursework that maybe you took advantage of, industry associations, conferences, I think all really helpful in closing the gap. So talking about translating this from maybe kind of your candidacy in terms of the application process more to an actual interview. So it's very similar. So who's the reader or the interviewer? What are they looking for? Do my bullet points or my stories really translate to show my capabilities? Again, anticipate the questions. You are going to get a lot of questions about why there's a gap. If you glaze over it, I think that's going to just leave a lot of room for questions. As I mentioned earlier, I would really kind of pause if a candidate tried to dance around a gap or never mentioned it. And I had to kind of point it out and say, wait, hold on, I'm looking at the years. So what happened for this year? I don't see anything here. That would raise questions for me. Why didn't they mention it? If they didn't kind of share why they're now looking and not currently employed proactively, that would raise a lot of questions for me. But when it was just told as an honest, direct story and kind of address some of what we've already discussed so far, I felt very, very comfortable moving that person forward in the process. So anticipate the questions and be prepared to talk about them. Like, why did you leave? What prompted you to take your next role? How have you stayed current while you've been away? How do you know that this next role is the right role? What would your previous employer have to say if we were to conduct references? Really think about that and think about how you can proactively address that, because the more proactive you are, the more confidence that you project, it'll just bring such a great comfort level to the hiring team. Especially as it relates to other candidates, many of them probably have some sort of a gap. So that's a way that you can really stand out. Just a few things, keep the date simple. Don't put months. I think if there's a short gap of, a month or two, like that's really just how things go sometimes. And so it's just better to stick with years. No need for getting granular with months on your resume. We already talked about addressing the gaps directly. Focus on relevant recent experience, and no need to include a lot of filler or fluff. Still keep it really concise and relevant. And actually, before I move on to LinkedIn, I also just want to mention something I didn't touch on yet, which is never, and I think everyone knows this, but feel the need to kind of bring it up for the group. Even though you may have left the most toxic situation, and there's so many reasons why, I'll go back here, and there's so many reasons why it's not your fault that you might be on a gap or not currently employed. Still keep it high level, factual. Obviously, only talk about your previous employer in a positive light, because the moment you start to speak negatively about it is really the moment that a hiring team or new employer, prospective employer would have a lot of questions. It's just never a good look. And, anyone would be concerned, I think, hiring someone who's speaking negatively about an employer. You can say it wasn't a good fit. There were organizational changes and it really no longer leveraged your skill set. The manager changed and it just really wasn't the right fit. You can say things like that, but again, keep it factual. I would definitely take the time to update your LinkedIn to tell a clear story, make sure that it makes it's presenting you in the best light. It's a good time to kind of refresh that. So definitely take a look at your LinkedIn. Maybe there's a new photo or about section or tagline, whatever it may be. If you feel like you're missing a huge, like let's say you were out of the workforce, I don't know, a few years because of a personal reason, let's say, you might want to just address that if you're comfortable with it. I've seen that done effectively. If you have freelance work that you've been doing, feel free to add some of that. Something to think about. Making sure that whatever is out there in social media is something you feel comfortable with and good about, because they're going to look you up the moment they're considering your resume before they invite you to interview. This is really kind of something that's embedded all the way along, but just it's so critical to leverage your network, whether it's your SOM network, the broad Yale University, your undergraduate network, all your previous relationships from your work experience thus far, your personal connections, whatever it may be. It's really, your network's going to be so critically important to this, and it's really helpful. A lot of these people know you so well. They might already know the story in terms of why you're not currently employed or have had a gap. So they can be especially helpful in terms of facilitating connections, a great sounding board, and just in terms of your search in general. And you would hear this if you scheduled a coaching appointment. If you're newly out trying to look for your next step, networking, once you have a good sense of your resume, your story, it's really all about the networking. And typically applying for kind of random openings isn't going to be effective unless you're networking. And so if that's something that you want to learn more about, I would definitely recommend scheduling a coaching appointment, and they can talk through that with you. So that's kind of our prepared portion, which again, I know is somewhat general and kind of just foundational knowledge, because everyone has a different reason for having to address some sort of gap. And it really depends on what that is. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to Q&A. I think we have a couple that already came through, so I'll just take a minute to read it, and then I can select and respond. Just give me a minute. Oh, there was a question about, let's see. There's a question about defining, I think there was a slide earlier that mentioned a functional resume. I think that language was just kind of referencing a resume as it was maybe relevant to like a specific function you were in previously, or maybe kind of like not tailored to the to kind of what you're going for going forward. To kind of expand on that, and just rather than get caught up in the language on that slide, and more just how to think about the resume, I would say I would not have a tailored resume by any stretch for every role you're applying for. I just don't think that's at all sustainable. And candidly, employers spend very little time reviewing your resume. The hope is that they look at it at all, and that's why networking is so important, and getting picked out of the pile. But if they do read it, you don't want it to look out of touch either. And so you want it to be clear, concise, and just pull in a little bit of language that's relevant for your overall interest going forward. So let's say you've identified that you're trying to make a shift within a certain industry or to a different function, whatever it may be. You just want to make sure that your resume is taking that into account, and knowing that there are some common skills that the roles you're targeting are looking for, just making sure that you're showing that you bring that relevant experience. I wouldn't take the time, like I said, to have a new resume or a super tailored resume every time you apply for a new role. Absolutely not. I just don't think that that's possible. And your experience is your experience. So if it's transferable, it should be transferable across a number of things. You just want to make sure that you really take that view and kind of put it through that filter. Do you have specific advice for returning from long maternity gap? Is there an SOM support group for this? That's a great question in terms of a specific SOM support group. I'd have to look into that. Not that I know of, but I'll check. I think that the best help would be really scheduling an individualized coaching appointment. So you have full access to this. And I think Brandon, I see. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't know. Sorry, Rachel.
Okay, sorry. I thought I saw something come up. Brandon's on our alumni relations team. We'll look into that. I don't think there's not one that I know of off the top of my head, but you have access to an individualized one-on-one coach who can help you work through how to return from a long maternity gap. And that is something that has come up time and time again. We are very well versed in terms of working with you on that. So in terms of having general support, it's absolutely there. And as I said, you have one-on-one support. So I would definitely take advantage of that. How long an employment gap is considered too long before inviting scrutiny around employability? 3 months, 6 months, or longer in the present environment. So like, when does a gap raise questions? It's a good question. You know, my honest answer is it's never too long when explained properly. So when addressed directly with a clear reason, with what you're doing during that time, with how you've taken the time to really identify what the right next step is for you and why you bring those relevant skills, I don't think I don't think the gap would probably be too long. I feel more comfortable hiring someone who's been out a year that explains their experience in a way that makes a lot of sense, is really clear and easy to understand. I feel more comfortable with that 1 year gap versus the 2-month gap, and they're not being transparent and kind of not giving me a clear understanding of why. So to me, it's less about how much time and more about how you're talking about it. But you gave this in the question, it says, is it 3 months, 6 months, or longer? I don't think, and if you were to say 3 months, 6 months, or a year, I don't think any of that is too long as it's explained in a way that addresses any risks that could be a concern for the employer. This is a really good question. You mentioned only using years and not months on the resume. Is this common, and does it look like you're trying to hide something? Yeah, so our SOM template actually, and I think this is pretty common across a lot of the business schools, is to only use years. I think it's super common in this case. It's a good question. Does it look like you're trying to hide something? But as you get more and more experience, and I think post MBA onward is kind of counts as enough experience, it kind of looks difficult to read when you include months. It looks much cleaner, streamlined, easier to follow. So stick with years. And, if that does happen to hide a gap that's really, really short, I don't think that that's a big deal. You can always explain it when you're talking about it if you feel like it's something that should be proactively addressed. But also we know that sometimes people take little time in between starting roles. So that's not a big deal either. I just think it's much cleaner to have just years. And as you get more and more experience, it's just way easier to follow. And it's just standard. And because it's standard, it doesn't raise questions. Yeah. How have you stayed up to date with the industry during your career gap? Any ideas on how to answer this? I think this is a lot of different ways. I think it could be staying in touch with previous employers, being well read, if there are any kind of industry associations, conferences, whatever it may be, being a part of that. If you're in a field that has any kind of certifications or anything along those lines, obviously that would be important. But I think just staying well versed. If there are certain skills that become particularly important, maybe taking a class on it or practicing. If you've had, if you are able to have a little bit of freelance experience within that time, that's obviously one way to do it. But I think those are some examples of ways that you can stay up to date. What is the process to seek coaching on how to articulate the reasons of gap in a resume or LinkedIn? Can you give some insights if it would be a free service or chargeable? So alumni have complete access to the CDO coaching. You are able to go into, I think the platform would be CMS. It's something that I'm assuming is in newsletters, and however you registered for this event, I'm pretty confident the information is there. But you have access to a coach. So we have a coaching team. Some of us offer alumni coaching at different times. Some of us, we have one member of our team at the moment who does a majority alumni coaching, actually. So I'd say mainly one person, but a couple others as well get involved in alumni coaching. I have at times. And so you can go in and there will be time options available to you. They are 30-minute coaching appointments, and you can schedule time to speak with a coach about pretty much anything career related. And they would feel completely comfortable talking about looking at your resume, addressing your employment gap, looking at your LinkedIn, talking about how you're presenting and speaking about your gap. So if you wanted to just have a personalized 30-minute conversation about this, that is a part of your lifelong relationship with the SOM CDO. And you are not limited in terms of how many you do. We have alumni who sometimes have multiple sessions over the course of a few months, whatever it is that you need during this time. So that is absolutely something that you can take advantage of. Will prospective hiring managers expect to see growth during the gap? Will they see through someone calling themselves a consultant for the sole purpose of explaining a gap during job searching? That's a great question. I think there's a difference between saying I became a consultant versus just simply saying, you know, your reason for leaving your previous employer, and then you took some time to do some consulting work, get involved in a few different projects. It took off a little bit, spent some time digging into that, gave you also an opportunity to reflect on what the right next step is for you. I think that's a great way to explain it. I think you can absolutely on a resume kind of mention freelancing in some capacity or consulting work. So I think it's all about how you explain it. If you're not explaining why you left your previous employer and just kind of say, then I went into consulting and there's maybe a little bit more of a story there, maybe it'll look like you're trying to hide behind something. But I think you can do both at the same time. Talk about your consulting work and also how it gave you a chance to, you know, reflect on what's next or whatever that may be. And will prospective hiring managers expect to see growth during a gap? I mean, I don't think they're screening for how did this person grow. I think they're just trying to understand, does the story fit, make sense? Is it relatable? Probably. Are they using this time in some sort of a positive way? And that could look like a whole number of things. You know, there are some hiring managers, for example, who would probably be super intrigued by travel or something like that, you know, and maybe it's a global role. Maybe you work with people all over the world, and that's actually just something that's the fact that you took the time to do something like that is really interesting. So it's not as though everyone's, I don't think, I think it's unrealistic to say like, oh, what language did you use during this time off? I mean, if it were me, that would never be something I could do. I think it's more just, are you explaining this in a way that makes sense? Are you using the time effectively in some way? And it could be whatever makes sense for you. But I don't think that they're screening for having met specific goals, for example. Um, does the open to work banner in LinkedIn detract from candidates' perceived employability, or does it make candidates appear desperate? That's a good question. I feel like the open to work and the am hiring, those kind of banners on LinkedIn haven't been around so long. So I don't have experience with those from when I was on the other side. I honestly think that if you're openly out in the market, I think it's fine. I would not personally think someone looks desperate for having that. I feel like lately when I look on LinkedIn and, for example, see some tech layoffs, there's so many, what seem to be so many phenomenally talented candidates who, were just in an industry that experienced layoffs. And so it seems very common for incredibly bright, accomplished people to have the open to work banner. So no, in that context, I personally don't think there's anything wrong with it. What I always say for LinkedIn, and it might actually be a great thing for you to do, by the way. What I always tell people in terms of LinkedIn is, while there are some best practices, at the same time, it's your personal social media, and whatever it is it's out there for anyone in your network to see. And so it just has to be something that you feel comfortable with. So if that's not something you feel comfortable with, then I don't think you need to do it. And while on one hand with a resume, I think that there's sometimes just pretty good do's and don'ts, and then you kind of take that and work with it and do what you feel comfortable with. But on LinkedIn, I really do feel like it's an extension of you out for the world to see, and it has to feel right for you and be something you feel comfortable with. There are a couple other questions I may have missed. So I'm just going to go back for a minute. Oh, on LinkedIn positions, should roles and responsibilities be included in the profile as well as the new additional information that is asked for, or just list the position? I would say that your LinkedIn profile should not be your resume on LinkedIn. It should be much more concise and high level. So I wouldn't have a bunch of bullets, for example, underneath each position on LinkedIn, like copied and pasted from your resume. Your LinkedIn profile should be something that is really easy to quickly scan. Shouldn't be overly detailed, but I think it's also helpful to maybe just have like a short little summary underneath each role if you feel like that could bring some keywords in, and maybe make it come to life a little bit more, but it shouldn't be long. It should be really brief. Sometimes having certain keywords can be helpful because just like the algorithm would allow you to come up in different recruiting searches. So it could be helpful to just make sure that you get some keywords in there potentially that are particularly relevant for what you're interested in. So it's another way to do that. But I wouldn't have it be the same as your resume. It should be way shorter. And the new additional information that is asked for, not being in LinkedIn, I'm having a hard time placing exactly what that is, to be honest. But my answer is kind of the same. Like, I think with LinkedIn, and I think with LinkedIn, if you think that there's something more that you could put that would be useful or helpful, feel free. Absolutely. It could be useful, but it's also an extension of you on social media, and you should just feel comfortable with it. So I don't think that, not every LinkedIn profile looks the same for that reason. So ultimately you should do what feels right for you. Let me just look to see if I missed anything. I haven't seen any new questions come in, so I'll give it another couple minutes. I'll also scan back and see if there are any specific questions that I missed. But you know, if you need to hop off, totally understand. If you have any questions that come to mind, feel free to type them in, and I'll just go back and look and see if I missed anything. Oh, there was a question about the LinkedIn slide. What did you mean about beware of new title options? I think that might be a LinkedIn feature, and something around people putting in maybe different types of titles. I think this has come up before, but I understand why that didn't necessarily make sense. Just stick with your title, I think is the point, and I think that's really the point there. Okay, I think that's it. So I don't see any new questions coming in. Again, really appreciate these great questions, you joining. As I said, our office is absolutely here to have individual conversations through alumni coaching appointments, and wishing you the very best in your search. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks so much for joining.